Most people on Earth cannot drink milk. Not won't, cannot. Their bodies lack the enzyme to digest it properly. Consuming it causes bloating, cramps, nausea, and pain. For approximately 65% of the global adult population, milk is not a food. It is a mild poison. The people who can drink milk, who digest it easily, who grew up thinking it was completely normal, are the genetic anomaly. They carry a mutation that appeared in Northern Europe sometime between 5 and 10,000 years ago. Before that mutation, every adult human on Earth was lactose intolerant. That was the default setting of our species for 300,000 years. The mutation spread fast because in the environments where it appeared, being able to drink raw animal milk was such a significant survival advantage that the people who carried the gene had more children, who had more children, who eventually replaced the populations around them. Not through conquest, through biology. Today, the global dairy industry is worth approximately $900 billion. It shapes land use across entire continents, drives climate change at measurable scale, and sits at the center of some of the most contested nutritional science of the last 50 years. All of it built on a mutation that most of humanity doesn't carry. What if milk had never existed? What if that mutation had never spread? The mutation that changed everything. Here is something that should be more widely known. Lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk sugar, lactose, into adulthood, is not the human default. Every mammal on Earth is born with the ability to digest its mother's milk. That ability is essential for infant survival, and in every mammal except a small fraction of modern humans, that ability switches off after weaning. The body stops producing lactase, the enzyme that breaks down lactose, because there is no longer any need for it. Milk is for infants. Adults eat other things. This is still true for most humans. The majority of people in East Asia, Southeast Asia, West Africa, and significant portions of the Middle East, South America, and Southern Europe are lactose intolerant as adults. This is not a deficiency or a disorder. It is the ancestral human condition. But here is something remarkable. Humans were using dairy long before the mutation appeared. The oldest cheese ever found was discovered in Poland, dating to approximately 7,500 years ago. Strainers with milk fat residue showing that Neolithic farmers were already separating curds from whey. They couldn't drink raw milk, so they transformed it. Fermentation and culturing break down most of the lactose in milk, making cheese, yogurt, and kefir digestible even for people without the mutation. The ingenuity came first. The genetics followed. The mutation that allows continued lactase production into adulthood appears to have originated independently in several populations. But the version that spread most dramatically emerged in Northern Europe. The earliest evidence of dairy farming dates to around 9,000 years ago in what is now Turkey and the Fertile Crescent. But the populations that first domesticated cattle were largely lactose intolerant. They processed milk into fermented products rather than drinking it raw. The mutation that allowed raw milk consumption came later, and when it came, in an environment where cattle were already central to the economy and culture, it conferred an extraordinary advantage. In Northern Europe, particularly during periods of famine, crop failure, or seasonal scarcity, a person who could drink raw milk directly from an animal had access to calories, protein, fat, and vitamins that their lactose-intolerant neighbors could not easily obtain. The difference in survival rates was significant enough that over several thousand years, the mutation spread from a tiny fraction of the population to a majority. In Ireland and Scandinavia today, lactase persistence rates approach 90%. This is one of the most dramatic examples of recent human evolution on record. A genetic trait spread through an entire continental population in a few thousand years, the blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. Milk didn't just feed Northern Europeans, it changed what Northern Europeans are at the level of DNA. The mutants were everyone else. How milk built empires. The civilizations that could drink milk and those that couldn't diverged in ways that shaped the modern world. Pastoral cultures in Northern and Central Europe, cultures built around cattle, sheep, and goats, had a nutritional resource that agricultural civilizations in Asia and Africa largely lacked. A renewable source of high-quality animal protein that didn't require slaughtering the animal. A cow gives milk for years. Kill it, and you eat once. The logic of dairy farming created a fundamentally different relationship between humans and animals, and between humans and land. Mongol warriors who swept across Eurasia in the 13th century survived on fermented mare's milk, kumis, during campaigns that covered distances no other army in history had matched. Their horses provided not just transportation and military power, but food. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history, was sustained in significant part by dairy. When Genghis Khan's armies moved, they brought their food supply with them on the hoof. The expansion of European colonial power from the 15th century onward carried dairy culture with it. Cattle were among the first animals transported to the Americas, to Africa, to Australia. Indigenous populations that had no history of dairy farming had low rates of lactase persistence, and therefore struggled to digest the milk that European settlers considered a staple. This created a hierarchy that persisted for centuries. Dairy as the food of the colonizers, associated with health and civilization, while the inability to digest it was pathologized as a deficiency rather than recognized as a biological norm. In the 20th century, the dairy industry took this logic and industrialized it. In the United States, the National Dairy Council, a lobbying organization funded by dairy producers, spent decades embedding dairy consumption into the institutions of American life. They funded school lunch programs that made milk mandatory. They financed research at universities that consistently found dairy beneficial. They worked directly with the United States Department of Agriculture to shape the food pyramid, the nutritional guide that was distributed to every school in the country, ensuring that dairy had its own prominent food group, separate from other proteins, requiring multiple daily servings. The Got Milk campaign, launched in 1993 and running for over 2 decades, spent approximately $300 million per year at its peak. It was not a spontaneous cultural phenomenon. It was one of the most sustained and expensive marketing operations in the history of food, funded by a mandatory assessment on dairy farmers and directed by an industry that understood exactly what it was doing. The result? Multiple generations of Americans grew up believing that 3 glasses of milk per day was a nutritional requirement backed by neutral science. It was backed by science. The science was not neutral. The science they got wrong. In 1955, the American physiologist Ancel Keys published research suggesting that dietary fat, particularly saturated fat from animal products like dairy, was the primary cause of heart disease. His 7-country study became one of the most influential pieces of nutritional research in history. It shaped government dietary guidelines across the Western world for decades. It launched the low-fat movement. It made full-fat dairy a public health enemy. There was a problem. Keys had data from 22 countries. He published data from 7. The countries he excluded were ones that didn't fit his hypothesis. Countries where people ate significant amounts of saturated fat, but had low rates of heart disease. The selective use of data was not hidden exactly, but it was not widely publicized either. The result was half a century of dietary advice telling people to avoid the saturated fats in whole milk, butter, and cheese, and to replace them with vegetable oils and low-fat alternatives. The food industry responded by producing an enormous range of low-fat and fat-free dairy products, and replacing the fat with sugar, because fat-free dairy tastes like cardboard without something to compensate. Meanwhile, research published in the 2000s and 2010s began to challenge the saturated fat hypothesis directly. A 2010 meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition reviewed data from over 300,000 people and found no significant association between saturated fat consumption and heart disease. But the simple story that Keys told, the story that shaped 50 years of public health policy and made full-fat dairy a guilty pleasure, was almost certainly wrong in important ways. The dairy industry itself spent decades funding research designed to rehabilitate its products. The truth about milk and health sits somewhere in the contested middle, still being argued over, still not fully resolved. And then there is China. For most of Chinese history, dairy was essentially absent from the diet. The overwhelming majority of the Chinese population is lactose intolerant. As recently as 1980, per capita dairy consumption in China was negligible. Then the Chinese dairy industry, backed by the government and inspired by American marketing playbooks, launched one of the most audacious nutritional campaigns in history. The message was simple. Milk makes you tall, strong, and intelligent. It was aimed specifically at parents of young children in a society intensely focused on the health and educational success of the single children permitted under the one-child policy. It worked. Between 1980 and 2010, Chinese dairy consumption increased by approximately 900%. A population that had functioned perfectly well without milk for thousands of years was convinced within a single generation that milk was a nutritional necessity. The lactose intolerance problem was solved the same way the Neolithic Europeans solved it. Fermented products, lactase enzyme supplements, and small enough quantities that symptoms were manageable. The marketing worked faster than the biology could object. The dairy industry today. Today, global milk production exceeds 900 million metric tons per year. The industry is worth nearly $1 trillion. It employs hundreds of millions of people worldwide and sits at the center of agricultural policy in virtually every major economy. It also sits at the center of one of the most significant contributors to climate change. Livestock, primarily cattle raised for beef and dairy, account for approximately 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. That is more than the entire global transportation sector. A single dairy cow produces between 70 and 120 kilograms of methane per year, a greenhouse gas approximately 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. To put that number in perspective, if the global dairy industry were a country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter on Earth, behind only China and the United States. The land use implications are equally significant. Approximately 80% of global agricultural land is used for livestock grazing or growing feed crops for animals. The dairy industry is the primary driver of deforestation in significant portions of South America, where forests are cleared to create pasture for cattle. The water footprint of dairy is enormous. Producing 1 liter of milk requires approximately 628 liters of water when you account for the water used to grow the feed. Against this, the dairy industry employs 275 million people in developing countries, many of them smallholder farmers for whom a single cow or a small herd represents their primary economic asset and their family's food security. The global North's consumption of industrial dairy and the global South's dependence on small-scale dairy farming are two entirely different industries that happen to produce the same product. The alternative dairy industry, oat milk, almond milk, soy milk, plant-based products of every description, has grown explosively in the last decade, reaching tens of billions of dollars in annual revenue. The question of whether they are genuinely better for health, for the environment, for the economies that depend on dairy farming is actively contested and genuinely complicated. The milk we drink today. Here is a fact that most people who drink milk every day don't know. The milk in your refrigerator came from a cow that was almost certainly pregnant or had recently given birth when it was milked. Modern dairy cows are kept in a near continuous cycle of pregnancy and lactation, artificially inseminated, milked through most of their pregnancy, dried off briefly before calving, then milked again almost immediately after giving birth. The calves are typically separated from their mothers within hours of birth. Male calves in dairy operations are largely economically useless. They don't produce milk and are the wrong breed for beef. Most are sold for veal or slaughtered shortly after birth. The dairy cow herself, in industrial production, typically lives 4 to 5 years before her milk production declines enough that she is sent to slaughter. The natural lifespan of a cow is approximately 20 years, and there is one more thing most people don't know about the milk they drink. It has been pasteurized, heated to kill bacteria, since Louis Pasteur demonstrated the process in 1864. Pasteurization eliminated the bovine tuberculosis, brucellosis, and other pathogens that killed tens of thousands of people annually when raw milk was the norm. It is one of the most consequential public health interventions in modern history. But pasteurization also changes the flavor and nutritional profile of milk. Raw milk advocates, and there are enough of them in the United States to constitute a significant market, argue that the real product, the original product, is something fundamentally different from what most people buy in a supermarket. In many American states, selling raw milk is illegal. In others, it sells for $20 a liter or more, purchased by people who see it as both a superior product and a political statement against industrial food systems. The same milk, drunk for 10,000 years, now available in dozens of varieties, the subject of lawsuits and legislation, priced anywhere from 30 cents to $20 a liter, simultaneously celebrated and condemned, and consumed by a species that is mostly not biologically designed to drink it at all. This is not presented as an argument for or against dairy consumption. It is presented as information that most dairy consumers don't have. The milk in your coffee every morning comes from a system with an economics and a reality that is largely invisible to the people who benefit from it. Finale. A world without milk. No pastoral cultures built around cattle across the Eurasian steppe. No Mongol Empire sustained by fermented mare's milk on campaigns that crossed a continent. No European colonial expansion carrying dairy culture to every place it touched. No mutation that spread through northern European populations and changed the genetics of an entire region. No trillion-dollar global industry. Significantly less methane in the atmosphere. Significantly more forest. One enzyme, produced by a mutation in a population of cattle farmers in northern Europe 10,000 years ago. But here is what the history of milk actually tells us, beneath the science and the industry and the politics. Every food in this series has had a story that was hidden in plain sight. Sugar looked sweet and was built on slavery. Coffee looked like a simple pleasure and was the infrastructure of revolution. Tea looked like a domestic ritual and was an instrument of empire. Salt looked trivial and ended one. Milk looks normal. For 65% of humanity, it never was. The things we take for granted as natural, as normal, as simply the way things are almost never any of those things. They are the result of specific histories, specific mutations, specific decisions made by specific people in specific circumstances. You are drinking the product of a genetic accident that happened 10,000 years ago, industrialized over the last century, contested by science for 50 years, and taken entirely for granted every morning. That is what food does. It hides its own history in plain sight. And we keep drinking it without asking why.